Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Kusum Wijetilleke. My guest today is Dr. Ravi Rannan-Eliya, the Executive Director of the Institute for Health Policy. Dr. Ravi, thank you very much for being here. You are the Executive Director for the Institute for Health Policy. You are a physician, but also an economist. So I'll shift from one area of expertise to the other. Sure. Briefly, I'll just mention you studied political science at the University of Cambridge and you completed a PhD at Harvard. You have, just to give our audience a taste of the kind of experience you have research, consulting and field experience, including Sri Lanka and the UK, Serbia, Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, Palestine, Thailand, Malaysia, India, Singapore, Brunei, Korea, China, Hong Kong.
Quite a long list to read.
Mongolia, Guatemala, Ecuador, Bolivia. Okay. So just to give people an understanding that you've been well traveled with your academia.
Yeah.
Having worked for the Institute of Policy Studies in the mid-90s, the Institute of Health Policy grew out of the IPS, and you've been studying various aspects of the health industry throughout your career. How would you describe Sri Lanka's COVID-19 response and management of COVID-19? I mean, it's generally the narrative that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the government was very successful in the management of COVID, that Sri Lanka was an example for the management of COVID throughout the world. He in fact said, you know, why not talk about how well we did? There's certainly been a very efficient rollout of the vaccination program, but when the Delta variant struck and there was the spike in cases and deaths, things started turning in the opposite direction. So would you like to comment on the overall performance of the Sri Lankan state?
Sure. I mean, to be honest, this is something that I spent probably 90% of my time working on the past 3 years, so there's a lot that could be discussed. I think in your first part, which is, you know, is it a success or not? I think in the end it wasn't. I think that in 2020, in the first year, it was probably a reasonable success. Sri Lanka was probably in the top decile of performers globally. Right. We managed to suppress the initial entry of the virus. We essentially got to zero COVID. We had occasional outbreaks, and we were pursuing, you know, some people call it a zero COVID strategy. The presidential strategy talks about the hammer and dance. The GMOA also talks about hammer and dance. But essentially, they were pursuing a strategy which was essentially saying, we can keep the virus out. Whenever it gets in, we'll find it and crush it and get back to normal. And that was the policy, and it basically broke down, I think, quite early. Probably broke down in the middle of 2020. We have evidence now that the virus had crept in undetected in probably June or July of 2020. Okay. And it broke out in the Brandix outbreak, which suddenly emerged. But you know, by that time, the virus had been spreading for several months in Sri Lanka, undetected. And at that point, we essentially lost control. So we never went back to zero COVID. And in a sense, you know, the rest is history. And why do I say it's a partial success? I think the initial actions were very good. And we were very lucky as well. Okay, and I think we should also understand the role of luck sometimes. Yes. So I'll just tell you what the role of luck is, perhaps not so appreciated. One of the things that, contrary to what people might think about our relationship with China, we don't actually have a very intensive relationship with the Chinese economy. Okay. And so, you know, the epidemiologists, many people have done this research, published on this, they've estimated in January, February 2020, how many people carrying the virus left China and where they went. And they looked at airplane flights and the frequency of infection, etc., and checked and cross-checked with, you know, what countries were reporting. All these studies show Sri Lanka had a very low exposure to the virus initially. Okay. In fact, we caught one person at the airport on January 28, 2020. And so, unlike the rest of Asia, we were not exposed to a huge inflow of virus initially. Okay. So we were very lucky. Europe, America, they have much greater links with China, surprisingly, for some people. So that was the role of luck. And then our initial response, the closing of the borders, I think the entrustment of the border quarantine to the military, something I have to say initially I had a lot of misgivings about, and I had some concerns, but I think in the general they did that well. So we had effective border security, and we had a very strong public health side, which could do contact tracing and isolation very well. And that's a legacy of our health system. So, we're one of the few countries to have eliminated malaria. Right. So to control some of these things, we had the same kind of interventions, and we had the people who knew how to do this. So we did that very well early on. But the Achilles heel of that response, which is not, I think, a failure by the political authorities, and I should mention, I'm just finishing some work with colleagues and with Johns Hopkins looking at the response to COVID in Sri Lanka, right. Sort of a retrospective. And we've been doing interviews with many senior officials and others, key stakeholders. The key failing was in the health authorities. The health authorities failed to understand that a zero COVID or the hammer and dance strategy required extensive surveillance in the community even when you had zero cases. So you had to be testing people in the community with coughs and colds and runny noses. Not people who fell sick and got warded in the hospital who turned out with pneumonia. You had to be testing people with coughs and colds. We never did that. And they completely ignored the research. And I should point out the research on this came from Sri Lankans. There was I think in many ways the most critical piece of research was done by a Sri Lankan Australian researcher at ANU. She's in Australia. And once Australia, so if you look at the Western response, Australia and New Zealand copied China. They basically managed to follow zero COVID for 2 years, and they were much more successful than we were. Now, what was the difference? What this Australian researcher of Sri Lankan origin did was she showed in, I think, March, April 2020, she said, what will happen when we get to zero cases? We have closed borders, but we know the virus is going to leak into the community. What do we do to prevent us having new waves? So how do we detect the virus early enough in the community so that we can crush it? And her modeling told the Australians they had to do, I think it's 1 test per 1,000 per day of people with coughs and colds. The New Zealanders took that, they did their own modeling, came up with very similar numbers, and they did that. And Australia also largely did that. China did that without doing the modeling. They sort of came to that conclusion in a different way. And so by doing that, if you look at Sri Lanka, we should have been doing 20,000 tests per day in the community during 2020. Now, we didn't, because every time this was proposed, it was rejected. People will say, oh, we don't have the machines to do it. But when the machines were offered, they were turned down by the Ministry of Health, including at the highest level. And what I've learned now from our interviews that we talk to political authorities, they're saying the health people never told us this. They never told us about the uncertainty. And I also know that, you may not remember, but during the middle of 2020, the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros, was telling countries, you need to test, right? The regional director of WHO in our region, Southeast Asia, was also saying test, replicating the message. I happen to know that when people in the Ministry of Health asked, for example, people in WHO about this, they were told, no, don't worry, you're doing fine.
Okay.
So I think there was a huge medical technical failure. I think in many ways, probably the worst public health failure in this country for 50 years to understand the importance of testing. And because of that, we ended up with continuous transmission. It broke out in Gampahai in the Brandix cluster, and then it became uncontrollable. And we sort of lost control of the plot at that point. In that sense, I think once we moved into 2021, there was great reluctance then to ramp up testing, because I think it was going to be pretty difficult to control, and people didn't understand why testing was critical. And so, as you know, the Delta, first the Alpha variant came in, and that was sort of ignored, and there was a bit of political pressure on that, I think, because then at that point there was this desire to open the economy for tourism as well. And then the Delta variant came, and all these were predictable.
Right.
And so I think my guess is, I don't think we will know the true death toll for several years now until our final death certificate data comes out from the Registrar General, and that usually takes many years. But my guess is, we would have suffered the loss of 20,000 Sri Lankans during this pandemic so far. So this is a huge toll. And in the end, it didn't work in resuscitating the economy, as we found. So that's another story.
True. I just wanted to follow up on something you mentioned, the zero COVID policy. Now, I've noticed that this is not the policy everywhere. And could you just tell us what is a zero COVID policy and what is the alternative, and what you think of the debate between the two? Because China has a zero COVID policy.
China is about right now.
And China has very few deaths, versus the United States.
Millions.
So, but then would you say that one was more successful in terms of an economy, in terms of, because there are other externalities, right? Let's say you close down the economy like China did. Were there mental health issues? Were there a spike in suicides? Were there spikes in alcoholic abuse, etc.? So could you just give us an idea of what the results were, the outcomes of each policy?
So, I mean, right now, the only country which is now trying to implement zero COVID is China.
Okay.
And that is because the two things have changed since 2021. The virus has become much more infectious.
Right.
So control interventions to get back to zero have become much, much harder by an order of magnitude. So I think that's simply because the virus has just evolved, even with vaccination. So I think that needs to be borne in mind. And the second thing is vaccination has changed the picture because vaccination has sort of blunted some of the serious mortality numbers you get if you had uncontrolled spread. Okay. So you have countries like Australia and New Zealand now. Australia essentially followed zero COVID for 2 years. It transitioned out. The New Zealanders delayed a bit, and then they've also transitioned out, but with very high levels of vaccination protection. I mean, even now, Australia still has 30, 40 deaths a day. I mean, this is not a trivial number. But they've decided to live with it. They weigh the cost and balance, and that's with the vaccination. But I think in the first year, 2 years, the zero COVID strategy in places like Australia and New Zealand, and unfortunately it's associated with China, which I think has a lot of negative associations with many Westerners, but also many people in Sri Lanka. Yes. But let's not forget Australia and New Zealand, Anglo-Saxon liberal democracies. And the thing to know about zero COVID does not mean lockdown. Okay. This is the important thing that people have simplified this notion. It is not about lockdown. What the Chinese, the Australians, the New Zealanders showed was that as long as you have effective border security, you can control the inevitable outbreaks you get when the virus comes in through very intensive test, trace, and isolation. So if you look at the countries, globally, Australia had the least lockdown. New Zealand had the least lockdown. The average Chinese person had no lockdown, except for those in Wuhan, and then recently with Omicron. But in the first 2 years, 99% of the Chinese population were not living in lockdown. So this is a complete misunderstanding. And it also ignores the critical fact that actually it wasn't the lockdown that was most effective. It was the contact tracing, the testing, tracing, and isolation that was, until vaccines came along, the most effective control intervention. Now with vaccines, and this is also not understood, and I have to say, I saw a recent editorial in the Daily Mirror which made this mistake. It talked about herd immunity with vaccination. What is not well understood, but it's been known by the epidemiologists for a very long time, I think since January 2021, so now it's almost 18 months, is that with current vaccines, it is not possible to get herd immunity. Okay. And we knew that for Pfizer as early as January 2021. Right, okay. Because although the vaccines may be very effective at reducing illness, they're not so effective in controlling transmission. Okay. They're less than 50% effective, and with Omicron, the numbers have got worse. So that I think is something that should be understood. But I think it is not about lockdowns. In fact, the data on lockdowns, and I speak as a researcher, it is very hard to show that lockdowns worked. So this is a complete miscomprehension. And I think it's also related to the kind of the way science works, or the popular, or the way scientific discourse works, because I think in many Western countries they're fixated on this idea. And of course, initially they rejected lockdowns because that's what the Chinese did in Wuhan, and then of course they ended up doing far worse lockdowns. But I think that simply ignores the critical thing, that if you want to control the virus, at least initially, it was a test and trace.
Okay. I'd like to spend more time discussing the economy because we're in the midst of a historic economic collapse, so I feel like that might be apt. Could you share some of your thoughts on the policies Sri Lanka needs to adopt going forward? Now, there's two things. I mean, there's policies for stability, for solvency, for liquidity. But there's also policies for growth. Now, is there a balance between the two? Because on one side, we are insolvent, essentially. We've never been bankrupt. We're bankrupt. Yeah. On the other side, we're in a recession. So the only way out of recession is to grow. So how do you balance the two, in your view?
I think, obviously there are short-term measures and there are longer-term measures. But I think in order to plot a sustainable road out of this to a better future, which is, I think, what most Sri Lankans want, I think it needs a fundamental reappraisal of our whole development strategy.
Okay.
So, this, and I think it's very unfortunate. And I was talking to you just before we started went on air that one of the problems in Sri Lanka is this demonization of your political opponents,
Right.
which leads to people not looking objectively at the record or at the facts. Right. Now, although I'm not sure the current administration, the administration that just stepped down, although it made some grievous policy mistakes, particularly on taxation, that precipitated the current crisis. This current crisis has been brewing for 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
And unless we understand that, we are condemned to make the same mistakes.
Okay.
And I would bet the same things will happen the moment we get an IMF agreement and we get out of it. We will go back to business as usual. So I think we have to start back and see what was the original failure. I think in the short run, I think everyone knows this, we desperately need an IMF agreement simply because that is the only way that we, and together with that, a restructuring of our debt, much of which is held by private investors in the United States. Those two things need to happen to get us back into a position where we can get international financing. So I think that's sort of the medium-term goal by the end of this year. To do that, we're going to have to demonstrate that we have a credible plan to pay down our debt over the medium term. And that means essentially raising more revenues than we spend. And that has to be based, as the IMF keeps on telling us, now I think I'm on social media, this is not well appreciated by some people in the political class. IMF, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, they have been telling us for years our primary problem is we don't collect enough taxes. And unless we collect substantially more taxes in the short term and longer term, we're not going to be able to lay a basis for recovery and prosperity.
Reg, you've been a little different, shall we say, against the grain, contrarian on this, because a lot of people on the fiscal equation,
I'm consistent with the IMF. So
well,
I'm not contrarian to the IMF.
I think I want to come to that, because actually what you're focusing, your emphasis is on the revenue side of the fiscal equation. Now, what is the traditional, the understanding within a lot of us, especially in Colombo, I can speak for mainly my circles, right?
Sure.
That we see the Sri Lankan government as spending way too much, as being wasteful on what they spend. We see the size of the government, the number of state employees, all this seems to be emphasized as the main issue. So could you give us your perspective on this and basically look at Sri Lanka's tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, and also who we are taxing and in what way we're taxing?
So let me make one observation first. Those ideas or beliefs that you just said, that we spend too much, we have too many public servants, that we need to cut spending. This is not new.
Yeah.
The political class have been saying this for 30 years.
Yeah.
They've pursued a fiscal and economic strategy based on that assumption. Look around you. Has it worked? Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter whether the cat is red or black as long as it catches the mice. Well, the cat we've been pursuing the past few years based on that notion hasn't caught the mouse or the mice, right? So it's failed.
Right.
So I think let's be real about this, right? Now, if you look at the objective data, so even if you don't know what the objective reality is, we need to maybe ask again, is that true? Is that really going to get us out? Because we've been doing that, right? And it's not true anyway. And I think that the IMF has pointed this out to us in the most recent statement they made back a couple of months ago. It's been pointed out also very extensively by the Asian Development Bank. I just read one of their reports earlier this year, which I read it last night. But they make 2 points. First of all, in terms of spending, compared to our income level, and it's important to compare to our income level because in general, as countries become richer, they spend a greater proportion of their national income through public spending, right? Because people want better social services, they want better infrastructure, they need better income redistribution, right? So this is a general pattern, I would say, of capitalist market-led development.
Okay.
Taxes go up as a share, spending goes up, okay. And it also becomes easier to collect taxes. The other thing that happens is that taxes go up. Okay, now if you look at spending, Sri Lanka is not a high spender. Government spending is far below what comparable developing countries at our income level spend, right? And you know, I have a slide here. This is from the Asian Development Bank, and you know, this is, I think you'll show the chart on
Yeah,
screen.
we'll show the chart on the screen.
But you know, this is an estimate that was done a few years ago, back in 2018. In 1990, we were spending 30% of GDP.
Right.
Government spending. At that time, that was about par for countries at our income level.
Right.
We have since become richer, so we should have increased the spending. Instead, by 2015, it had fallen to 20% of GDP. And at that point, we were spending 10% of GDP less than countries at our income level are spending typically, right? And if you look at the distribution of countries at our income level, we are at the low end. So when people say we're a high spender, I don't buy that.
Okay.
I'm not objectivist. I'm an empiricist, I'm a scientist. I look at the data. It's not true.
Right.
Right? So that's number one. Secondly, I think there was also a canard, which was, I think, for a long time that we had a very huge public sector. That also was not true. That came from a misquoted, I think, Asian Development Bank report table. I remember when I digged into it, and it wasn't true, but you know, this sort of gained currency amongst the political elite. So that's on the spending side. We are very low spenders, right? We are a low health spender. We are a low education spender. We have low infrastructure spending. Now, all these people in Sri Lanka who say, oh gosh, you know, the government is going to China and borrowing money and we're, you know, indebted to China, which is not actually true. We're indebted to Wall Street right now. That's the big problem, right? Yeah. But all these accusations, why do we go to China to borrow? They give us money to build infrastructure. Why do we borrow money to build infrastructure? Because we don't spend enough from our own resources. So spending is low. We have bad infrastructure, right, to achieve rapid economic growth. So that's the spending side. On the revenue side, the situation is even more dismal because the spending is low because the revenue is low. And again, Asian Development Bank has said this, World Bank has said this, IMF has told us. They've said their one message to us, the primary message to us, your biggest problem is taxes, insufficient taxes. They said our recovery program has to be, in their terms, revenue consolidate. I think it's fiscal, a revenue-based fiscal consolidation, right? That means get your fiscal house in order, but they use the adjective revenue-based, because what they're telling us in that use of very simple language, for those who maybe can't understand complex sentences, it has to be tax rise-based, right? Obviously, some people in this country in the political class cannot understand even those two words, right? So revenue-based fiscal consolidation. It's in the executive summary of what the IMF told us in their last statement, and it's repeated in that document. Now, why do they say that? Countries, as they become richer, collect more in taxes, right? In the 70s, maybe we collected too much tax, over 25% GDP. Okay. By 1990, 22% of GDP, right? And I have, you know, you can show the chart. And what's happened since then is that we became richer, but contrary, so we are the contrarians.
Yeah.
I'm not the contrarian for saying this, but Sri Lanka is the contrarian. In every other Asian country, as they became richer in the past 20, 30 years, they raised tax collection. Tax collection went up. And the ADB in a recent report said, emerging Asia average tax collection is 30% of GDP. If they talk about countries comparable to Sri Lanka at our income level, they said, well, countries at our income level, this is in 2015, were collecting 26% of GDP in taxes, right? We were collecting 13. We had to double tax collection even to match our peers. Now, what did we do in response to that? Under the previous administration, the Wickremesinghe-Sirisena administration, they made no improvement in raising overall taxes. So they left office with essentially a tax collection of 13% of GDP. And then this recently departed government cut taxes even more, and we went to 8 or 9% of GDP. So right now, we have a shortfall in tax collection, which you can estimate as variously from between 15 to 20% of GDP if you compare to our peers. That is our biggest problem, right? So this, I think, is, I don't think I'm being contrarian. I'm fairly consistent with the major development banks and the IMF. Sri Lanka is the contrarian here. Our political class have for far too long thought that market-led development depends on cutting taxes, and they're absolutely wrong.
Right.
And we need to be honest about this. And they don't. One thing I think is, I don't know if we'll discuss the minimum program. So maybe we can discuss that later, or
Yeah, we will.
Okay,
yeah.
sure.
I just wanted to ask, you've had some polling data that your institute has put out as well. Maybe not all of it is out in the public domain. But I'd like you to just discuss, after you, I'll ask you about the data sample and the methods, etc. But what were the participant preferences for each candidate, and what can we deduce about, for example, the participants' policy priorities and what the politicians seem to think should be the policy priorities?
So we sort of had two recent rounds of polling. We had some polling in the couple of months before the 2019 presidential election. It was very small scale, where we did ask for voting attention. And just to give you some idea of the accuracy of that poll, we only polled those questions in 6 districts, and our prediction of the presidential vote shares was accurate in those 6 districts to within 1 percentage point, right? Okay. Which I think is better than the polling for some of the major political parties that they were doing. So,
right.
So I think, just to give you some idea of the accuracy. So yes, so we've been polling people.
So what is the sample size roughly? And
that one,
let's say 2019.
2019 was only a few hundred. It was sort of an experimental effort. Now we're talking about 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people.
Great.
This is in the last 12 months, shall we say.
Great.
So in terms of candidates, I mean, we've been tracking presidential and general election voting preference since August of last year. We do it on a daily basis. And what it shows is that for, through the end of 2021, President Gotabaya, the ex-President Gotabaya, was favored. And then starting, and I think partly because the economy seemed to improve, at least that's how people felt it at the end of 2021. Okay. But then as the economic problems began to bite in the first half of this year, his popularity declined. In line with consumer confidence, it collapsed. And Sajid Premadasa took the lead. And he's taken a modest lead, and it sort of fluctuated until last week when the president left office. So that sort of situation, Sajid Premadasa maintained a small but modest lead over the ex-president in terms of presidential voting preference. Now, I should explain, we only allow people to give 2 choices.
Okay.
So we didn't ask about potential other candidates, and so that's something we have to change.
Okay.
But that's on the presidential polling. Maybe on the general election polling, then that's a bit more interesting. So if you...
May I just ask before, is there a demographic, specific demographic you ask, or is there something you can give us about the sample? Whether are they middle class, upper middle class, working class? How is it?
Sure.
Do you have any idea? I mean,
we actually have 2 different samples that we use.
Okay.
So one is a sample which we recruited in 2019. It was part of another scientific study done for epidemiological reasons.
Okay.
And that was nationwide, 300 communities in the country. It was designed for epidemiological purposes to give very accurate estimates.
Okay.
Percentage of people have hypertension to within within a few percentage, within a tenth of a decimal point, shall we say.
Okay.
So it was designed to be very robust, and it covers everyone, all income levels, all ethnicities, all parts of the country, et cetera, et cetera. So we are repolling those people by phone, and of course, the problem with the phone survey, you can't reach the poorest people.
Right.
Right. They don't have phones, or they keep their phones switched off. They can't afford to keep the phones on. We also have a second sample, which is a standard random, what we call random digit dial phone survey. We just call numbers randomly. And that sample is clearly skewed, as you would expect. It's skewed towards more urban people, younger people, better educated, higher income, etc. But what we then do is we combine that, and using the information we have from previously, we reweight the data so it is representative of every income level, every ethnic group, every province. So it's weighted across all dimensions. And for our political preference estimates, we also weight for the way people voted in the 2019 presidential election, and also how they voted in the 2020 general election.
Right, okay, so you've weighted it across, okay.
Right, and this is quite critical, because I think the problem we find, I suspect anybody else doing this would find, is that when you ask people their voting preference, and at least in the past year or so, until last week, the sort of people who opposed the government were much more reluctant to admit their preference.
Right.
So they would typically tell you, I wouldn't vote for anyone, or they would refuse to. And this is quite substantial. But you can see that when you then analyze the data, you can see these people are actually not typical. They're more likely to have supported the other candidate. And so we adjust for that. So we use standard polling industry from the US methods to adjust for all that.
Okay. You had mentioned in our chat before we started that the JVP NPP was a resurgence. So I just wanted to ask where you see that resurgence, it's in specific, is it the corruption, anti-corruption emphasis that they use, or is there some other thing that you've noticed in your polling data? And generally speaking, the JVP is popular in the run-up to an election, but then when the actual votes come in, they never seem to translate that into votes.
I think past history is not going to be a good predictor of what happens to the JVP.
Fine. Fair.
I think, to be fair, if I recall, the best the JVP have ever done was around 10% in a presidential election many decades ago. But let me break down. So it's a very complex situation that we see in our polling. So we see that Sajid Premadasa, since earlier this year, took the lead in the presidential preference.
Right.
So he would have won a presidential election pretty much most of this year. But it's more complicated than that. So we also poll on a daily basis political favorability of key figures, which, in other countries like the United States and Europe, the favorability of an individual also is correlated with how well he does in a presidential election or how well the party does in an election, right? So people look at Biden's popularity. It's tapped, right? It's about minus 30 or something these days, or it was about 30% popularity. So we've been tracking that, and the interesting thing is that since the beginning of this year, what we've observed is that, of course, President Gotabaya's favorability collapsed, pretty much in line with consumer confidence. Right. But Sajid Premadasa's favorability also collapsed.
Right.
So the two of them, and I checked the data this morning before I came in early July, both of them had favorability scores of minus 70.
The same.
This is from going from minus 100 to plus 100. Basically, 8 out of 10 people did not express a positive view of either Sajid Premadasa or the former president. So even though Sajid was in the lead, if there was an election, it was very soft support. It was people essentially reacting to the previous president. Now, when you ask about general election voting preference, where we give people more choices, what we found is, since the beginning of the year, this SLPP its support has collapsed, and not surprising. And the SJB UMP support has gone up. We categorize both of those together for trying to predict what goes on. JVP support goes up. So in our most recent polling in early July, JVP has reached about 30%. So if there was a general election, our best guess is they would get around 30% of the vote. That is far, far higher than they've ever done. And it's difficult to know because it depends how it's distributed, it depends what people do on the day. But my guess is, that what we're looking at creates, this very high unfavorability even for opposition politicians. Even, I must say, even the JVP leader himself, Mr. Disnayak, is also unpopular, but he's less unpopular than Sajid Premadasa, I should point out. Right. Because most of the political class is clearly discredited. I think that if you look to March of next year, it is really a wide open question what will happen in the elections in a few months' time, especially given the fact we're going to have to go through a lot of economic pain in the meantime. And my guess is JVP will increase its support, or maybe others further to the left. There's this FSP out there, which is got almost nothing in the last election. So I think that's that. Now, what's going on? I think there are several things, and we haven't had really. I'm making some inferences here from previous polling we've done to look at what people, what's driving, what's in people's heads. Okay. And I think several things. I think that there is widespread rejection of the political class. Okay. And I don't think the politicians understand this. This is, and it's not about corruption. I think because of the experience of people that people have had, It's almost like a pox on all the houses, right?
Right.
So that's the first thing. Second thing is there's a clear discordance, and it has been there for many years, between what the political class is talking about and what the voters seem to be interested in.
Yeah.
And particularly on this, my pet topic of taxes and spending, if you ask the public, the majority of the public, overwhelming majorities, say they want the government to spend more on health and education. They want the government to spend more on infrastructure. Right? Now, I'm sure there are people out there who will say, oh yeah, but these people are just dreaming. They think it's a free lunch.
Yeah.
And we've polled that. We've asked people and said, okay, you want to spend more on health or education or samudhi or whatever it is. Do you support that? If we'll tell them, look, the government has no money to increase spending, we have to raise taxes. Do you now support this? Guess what? Health, education, people still want. I mean, support goes down a bit, but overwhelming majority of people say they are willing to accept higher taxes to pay more, spend more money on these basic things, right? Yeah. Where is the opposition? It's in the top 20% of the income range. Mm-hmm. It's the top 20% of the income range who actually are not so happy about spending more if it means more taxes. They're also not so happy about spending more anyway. And they also oppose increases in things like income tax, corporate tax, much more than the majority of Sri Lankans. And you said you might think I'm a contrarian. I think I'm in line with the majority of Sri Lankan voters.
Right.
It's the political class who is not. Because we polled this before the last election, and
right.
we found this.
Right.
I have an editorial article in the Island I shared with you. And one other thing we picked up, we asked people what they thought was the problem, or the most important problems. Interesting. It was the economy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It wasn't corruption. Taxes, remember, both political parties ran on manifestos of tax cuts.
Yeah.
SJB is being very silent on that.
Yeah.
But they also ran on tax cuts, right?
Right.
And 4% of our samples said raise taxes as an issue. 96% of our respondents in 2019 did not raise the issue of taxes as being a problem, and both political parties ran on tax cuts. I would say the established political parties are the contrarians, if we take the people of Sri Lanka as the reference. So that's the numbers. So I think that, and the other thing we also found is, even on the corruption issue, we let people express it in their own way. People have they're a bit more sophisticated. I mean, if you ask the kind of words they use, when we try to distill this, it wasn't really corruption that bothered them. I mean, people don't like corruption, so I'm not saying people like it. Mm. But what they were telling us was they disliked the politicization of state services, political interference, the stuff that kind of clogs up service delivery. Ordinary people feel that. Right. That's what they're upset about, politicization of the whole state. Yes, corruption was there, but it wasn't the biggest issue. So I think ordinary people's feelings about good governance was not so much about the corruption, but about effective delivery. Okay. Right? And I don't think that's still not understood. I see several political parties are now campaigning on the issue of reversing the corruption. Yeah. They're not talking about other things without reversing corruption. So I think that's a basic misunderstanding. And a couple of other things that we have also picked up recently in our recent polling, but we also picked up last time, there is a majority of Sri Lankans are increasingly concerned about the gap between poor and rich.
Right.
In our recent polling, this is a key issue. And we also find that people say they think it's got worse. They think it's something government should do something about, whatever that is. So this is a serious issue. And go back to what the JVP might be capitalizing on. In the 2019 polling, where we looked at some of these attitudes in relation to voting preference, and JVP was an option in that polling. What we found was poorer people were much more supportive of the opposition. They were much more concerned about income inequality, about bad services, about insufficient spending. So the poorer 2/3, and they generally supported, more like to support JVP and SJB. And in fact, there was considerable overlap between the SJB and the JVP.
Right.
The urban, better off supported Gotabaya.
Right.
in SLPP. So let's be honest, the singular urban middle class better off people, they were the main support base. And I think what's going on now is that the SJP's problem right now is that they have failed to capitalize effectively on the rejection of Gotabaya by the electorate.
Right.
They fail to articulate a message that resonates with the majority of Sri Lankans. And I don't think an anti-corruption message is going to do that. I mean, people are stupid, right? I mean, every election, each side accuses each other of corruption. This has gone on for a century. And people can see beyond that.
Right.
And I think they want real change. I think they're concerned about the income inequality, the social disparities, the lack of services. And I think the JVP, does better at capitalizing on that. And of course, it has the advantage of being maybe less discredited by being less in power than the others.
Okay. I'd like to get onto the Common Minimum Program. It was compiled by the National Movement for Social Justice. It's got a lot of inputs from economists, business leaders, civil society, etc. I think it originally came out in February this year, and now they've done some rework on it. So I'm going to quote a few things from the from the 16th of July. There was a Daily Mirror article. So, sorry, did you want to clarify?
Well, I mean, it's got a nice word, national movement, and it says broadly based. It's not a broadly based discussion, right?
Right.
I mean, did they discuss with a wide section of political and social stakeholders? I don't think they did.
Okay.
Yes, business elite they talked to.
Okay.
But are the business elite the only stakeholder in our economy?
Let me quote a few things from there so then we can get your reaction. So they mention the current situation and the economic collapse. So they say the only analog maybe from 90 years ago when per capita GDP collapsed from $80 to $33 in a few years as part of the Sri Lankan manifestation of the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression was the United States, that was the 1920s to the early 1930s. How did the USA reemerge from the Great Recession? Just briefly, and then how does that compare to where we're heading in terms of trying to cut spending, fiscal consolidation? And I mean, there's obviously a fine line between the two and how you add them up to create a growth story. But how would you go about this?
I think that analogy only goes a little way.
Okay.
So I think the only analogous part of that is that there was a significant drop in living standards.
Right.
But the reasons were very different.
Yes.
The global recession, which hurt Sri Lanka very badly in the early 1930s, was essentially due to a collapse in global trade.
Right.
And we were, compared to other developing countries, relatively well integrated into global trade, so it affected us more.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Okay.
And we also, we exported tea and rubber and coconut, and then we imported rice. So, for a trade-dependent country like us, it hurt us. It hurt the rural areas.
Right.
But that is not analogous to the current problem or the reasons behind our current crisis. Back in the 30s through the 40s and 50s, Sri Lankan governments were very fiscally conservative.
Okay.
They did not run huge deficits. They had higher than average tax collection compared to other economies at the same income level. Now it's different.
Right.
We have lower tax collection. We have very loose fiscal policy for decades. So the problem is very different. And our problem here is not really the global environment. The global environment doesn't help, obviously, but the problem is much more an internal economic imbalance. And I think that's a fundamental difference to the 1930s.
Okay. Another thing they mentioned, Sri Lanka has the highest income inequality in South Asia between China and the US in international comparisons and provided little compensation for the harms caused by the pandemic and lockdowns. Yes. Our citizens in the lower deciles are unable to withstand more shocks. So they do explicitly mention income inequality, but there wasn't much conversation around redistribution. So it's what you mentioned before.
This is like crocodile tears.
Right.
Right?
There's just a huge
gap.
We're
concerned about this. But if you're really concerned, show us the money. What are you going to do in a real sense to deal with that? And yes, it's true, we have significant income inequality. It's become worse over decades. There is significant and growing public concern. And I would think that it will have ramifications in the political space. If political parties don't respond to this in a real way, then it creates space for other parties. And let me also remind you that I'm a bit older than you, so I've lived maybe through a bit more difficulties in this country than the current one. Inequality in our society, whether it's between rich or poor, or perceived inequality between ethnic groups have been highly destabilizing to this country, right? We have lost 250,000 Sri Lankans have died in violence in this country in my lifetime because of real disparities between people and perceptions that those disparities were unfair. So we can ignore this at our peril. So it is not enough to just say, oh, it's a problem. What are you going to do about it? And I don't see in the Common Minimum Programme any serious effort to deal with this problem.
Okay.
Or to appreciate its seriousness.
But I saw some of the charts that you sent me are corporate tax as a percentage of total government revenue and a corporate tax as a percentage of GDP is very low compared to not just our peers, but just overall. I mean, it was right at the end of the chart. So, I mean, we had, let's say, 28% during the Pioneer period for most corporates, but I don't think the effective tax rate was around 28%. It was definitely, you know, maybe 15% or
and then there are widespread tax holidays. So
and there are widespread tax holidays. Anyway. So, I mean, how would you change that? And would you, for example, some people point out the financial sector. You know, every quarter they'll make a few billion rupees, even if you're a small bank, even if you're a mid-tier bank. Sure. So would you tax them at a higher rate? Do you think that there's a risk to stability? How does that work?
So I don't want to get too much into the details of the minutiae of tax policy, but let me just make some broad brush points here. I mean, I have a chart. I just found it this morning from the Asian Development Bank's Asian Development Outlook. Which is focused on tax mobilization, interestingly. The importance of tax mobilization for development, right? So they're telling the whole of Asia this. And there's a chart in there which compares the composition, the tax mobilization, the share of GDP by type of tax. So the first thing to note in that chart, Sri Lanka is right at the right end because it has very low tax collection. So we collect very little tax. So that's the first thing. But if you look at the composition, and I sort of highlighted that, you can see that in terms of corporate corporate income tax in particular, and you compare corporate income tax collection as a share of GDP in relation to our Asian peers, our fellow Asian nations, it is much lower. I mean, if you wanted to have corporate income tax comparable to those other Asian countries, you will have to double or triple the take. Double or triple. Now, one of my issues with the Common Minimum Programme is saying, oh, we'll just go back to the 2019 or 2018 tax regime. That's not good enough, guys. I mean, this chart that we're looking at, this chart is for the 2015-2019 period. This is what the Asian Development Bank just recently published. That was the period of the last administration when these people are sending, oh, we had very laudable objectives and we did all this. No, that was atrocious. We need to call them out. And the fact is, we need to raise corporate income tax, we need to raise indirect tax in the short run, and we need to raise income tax. All the taxes have to go up. Now, what does it mean to raise corporate income taxes 3- or 4-fold? It will mean a whole range of things. It will mean it will mean getting rid of tax holidays, which are grossly misused. We need raising corporate marginal tax rates, removing exemptions. So I think all of that has to be done. We also need to raise income tax. We also need to raise VAT. Also in that report just came out from the ADB, our VAT rates are very low. So indirect taxation can also be improved. So I think we need to move substantially on all this.
If I were to just, to be fair to the Common Minimum Programme, it does quote, I quote, it is almost certain that entering into an IMF program will require commitment to a time-bound achievement of a primary surplus. That's one. And this will require the raising of revenue above current levels irrespective of the IMF. This is a laudable objective. Action to restore the tax regime that existed prior to 2019, that's what you mentioned, has already been initiated. Therefore, the proposals below look beyond the restoration of the 2019 revenue measures. So they have sort of stated that, but it is necessary to increase non-tax revenues by increasing the fees charged for services and revenue from state assets. And so I just like to touch on, first of all, a time-bound achievement of a primary surplus, and whether, how does that argument play out? And the IMF on one side will obviously ask for some kind of fiscal consolidation, fiscal conservatism going forward. But at the same time, achieving a primary surplus, does that risk the growth story?
So there are several things in what you just told me, and so I'm trying to remember them and trying to unpack that. So yes, to get an IMF agreement, we need that. Which essentially means, in very simple terms, we need more taxes than we spend.
Right.
So that we have some spare money to start paying down our debt.
Right.
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 But that's, the difference. It doesn't tell us how high those taxes are going to be and how high the spending is going to be.
Right.
It's just the difference.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So then they say, we're going back to the 2015-19 tax regime. And then they make a jump and say, well, then now we're going to look at non-tax revenues.
Okay.
User fees, user charges, or whatever. Okay?
Okay.
I just don't buy that. It simply ignores the reality. Even if we went back to the 2015-2019 tax regime, and remember, the economy was in better shape, people made more profits, so if we try to do that now, we'll get less, right? Even if we went back, the tax collection during the 2015-2019 tax regime was atrocious. We were still at the bottom of the pile in Asia. The Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, was still telling us then that we had insufficient tax collection. So it's not sufficient then to jump and say, oh, well, we'll do non-tax revenues. No. If they seriously understand the scale of our problem, and I don't think they do, for whatever reason, then they need to say, well, that is only the minimum that we need to do to raise tax. We then also have to raise taxes substantially.
Right.
Now, let me just give you the numbers. Even if we go from 8 or 9% to, say, 13% during the previous administration, that's not good enough. We need to get to 18, 20, eventually in several years down the road, 25% of GDP to lay the basis for solid, rapid economic growth. What they're suggesting tells me they don't get it.
Right.
They simply don't get the scale of the tax deficit or the failure we have. And I think that points to an even deeper problem. The fact that the political class and the so-called serious people in society can only come out with those kinds of recommendations, ignoring the huge tax hole that we have compared to our peers, goes back to that fact that we have a political culture which does not understand taxes.
Yeah.
They, for some reason, ideological, think taxes is somehow contrary to a market economy. They're the contrarians. The fact is that capitalist market economies have taxes. In fact, income taxes, I think, were invented by bourgeois capitalism.
Right. Okay.
So, as Marx would say, right? China, before the Cultural Revolution, had no income taxes.
Right.
They only introduced income tax after the Cultural Revolution when they switched to what they call a socialist market economy, which is basically a capitalist economy. Taxes are the bedrock of capitalism. These people have a contrary view to me, and I'm happy to admit my difference of opinion.
I'd like to ask you about this comment, the need to ensure that the provisions of the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act No. 3 of 2002 are scrupulously followed and was highlighted. Given the disappointing track record of since enactment, opinion was split on the relative importance of strengthening the Act versus ensuring a culture of compliance. Could you explain the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act and why it's important and what you think?
So, essentially, this was an act of Parliament where Parliament essentially said that future administrations would have to observe certain fiscal rules and certain fiscal reporting rules, and there's some reporting also. So that's what Parliament did. I have to say I was always very skeptical about this. This is an attempt to use legalistic solutions to solve an underlying, far more basic political economy problem.
Right.
And given the fact that Parliament legislates that, of course they can do what they want at the end of the day. So it's sort of, this is, so I don't quite get this. And so I think this did not address the fundamental problem, which is that the same politicians who voted for the Fiscal Responsibility Act are the same politicians who have facilitated our low tax environment.
Right.
And unless they're willing to change the way they think about things, we're not going to get out of this problem.
And another thing that I've noted you as contrarian, but you can correct me if I'm wrong,
yes,
is your idea of defense expenditure. A lot of people have been saying let's half defense expenditure. I saw one of the advices to the opposition leader, Mr. Premadas, I think his name was Mr. Rohan Pethiagoda, who mentioned that we should cut expenditure on the military in half going forward. Basically, he also mentioned retrenching staff of the public sector. So how do you feel about those prescriptions in a situation where we are trying to grow the economy to come out of a recession?
Sure. I think he's not an economist, right? He's a wildlife specialist or zoologist,
that's
right?
That's
yes.
right, yeah.
Okay, so I'm grateful that he's commenting on these important economic matters, which we have a right to as citizens.
Sure.
My take on the military, I think this has several sides to it. Okay. So first of all, we're not a high, based on the data I've seen, we spend about 2% of GDP or less on the military.
Okay.
Okay. And that, that's also questionable because, there are all sorts of odd things that are in the defense ministry budget. All right, so given the way that we run and organize our ministries, that's also another problem.
Okay.
But 2%, that is not high by Asian standards. And those countries in Europe, those peaceful countries of Europe who really don't face any existential security threat, they're trying to raise their defense spending to more than 2% of GDP, right? And they have nuclear weapons, right? They don't really need to fear for that security.
Right.
Right? So we're a small country next to a big country. We have some legitimate security interests. We also have a history, as I mentioned, 250,000 people have died in this country.
Right.
During my lifetime.
Right.
Being killed, right, through violence. So there's a legitimate security interest. So I think we need to be careful about evaluating our security needs and the appropriate expenditure. So that is one part of it, and I don't think it is excessively high. And one other comment I will make, most of that budget, I think, is for salaries.
Right.
Paying the military,
right.
for the soldiers, right?
So someone's livelihood.
Right. It's not for buying expensive toys,
yeah.
Right? I don't know, I don't track the military acquisition budget in Sri Lanka, but I don't see many reports of us buying expensive jets or planes or whatever. Right? Even the ships we have, half of them are like second-hand ships gifted to us by America or India or whatever. Right? We don't have many jet fighters. So we're not like other Asian countries who spend a lot on these toys.
Right.
So I think we need to be a bit cautious, number one. The other part of this is, in a situation where we face a lot of economic disruption, increased unemployment, social tension, does it make sense to stop paying those salaries to those soldiers? And for two reasons I have, two concerns I have. One is, do you want to let whole thousands of people who know how to fire guns out onto the streets at a time of social turmoil? Now, I read recently, I didn't know this was by DBS Jarraj, he had a nice article on the leader of the FSB.
Okay.
The leader of the FSB was previously in jail. Not everyone knows this. He raided an army military camp during the JV uprisings, managed to get away with some weapons, and then he was eventually captured by the military. This is a guy who's now in the political space.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So I think we need to be a bit cautious about putting young men with knowledge of guns and explosives back on the street. This is not a good time.
Yeah.
The other point to make, which is a more humanitarian concern, the salaries paid to those soldiers go back to their house, their families. It is not the rich people of our country who join the army. It is the poorer people. Right? Right or wrong, that is the reality. Right? It was also the poorer people who joined the LTE. So, this is a general pattern. And if we're going to cut, let's say we cut 1% of GDP, I'm just giving a number, 1% of GDP is cut in army salaries. Okay, most of that money is going to poorer households. Is it going to save us money? No. Because we're going to have to increase income transfers in some other way by 1% of GDP. It doesn't help us deal with the fiscal problem. Right? And it risks all sorts of other political risks. So my view would be, okay, freeze the army. Let people go if they want to go naturally through natural attrition. Now is not the time.
Okay. One final question, Dr. Ravi. Because we were talking about the common minimum program, I also just want to stress it does, and I quote, Sri Lanka should join the base erosion and profit shifting BEPS framework. And they've also mentioned a progressive corporate tax regime without sharp discontinuity. So that's just to be fair to the common minimum program. But on the subject of SOEs, so this is the next...
I think a 15% tax rate.
Yes.
I think. Yeah. So
Yes.
I think
But that's the BEPS, isn't it?
we should have a minimum tax rate. The previous government had rejected that. One of the few holdouts in the world rejecting that global tax treaty.
Right.
So I think we definitely should join it, but I think we need much higher tax rates on everything. And I don't think 15% is not enough. I mean, we need to triple corporate tax collection as a share of GDP to get back to where we are in relation to our peers. This is not going to do it.
On the subject of SOEs, the
yes.
Common Minimum Program mentions, and I quote, privatizing SOEs through private-public partnerships, liberalize industries where SOEs operate. So how do you see that dynamic? Now, if you take the two large SOEs, the CPC and the Ceylon Electricity Board, how do you see the privatization debate? I mean, from the point of view of electricity prices, energy prices in general, and if we're saying no subsidy for, say, petrol or no subsidy for electricity, is the country going to develop when you've got such a high rate for energy and incomes are roughly the same? I mean, you at least have to subsidize energy and manufacturing. So how do you see the debate on the SOEs? I mean, it seems...
So I think that there's some conflation there of some separate problems.
Right.
And there is some really woolly-headed thinking about strategy and sequencing. Okay. And the fact that they spend so much time in the Common Minimum Program document focusing on this tells me it's a bit woolly-headed, frankly. Okay. Now, what are my concerns? First of all, there is a separate problem. The CEB and the CPC are a significant drain on public resources. There's a huge amount of implicit debt because they're essentially borrowing to provide these things, right? But that's not, I don't think, a problem of the fact that they're state-owned enterprises.
Right.
That goes back to a problem of pricing, political pricing set by cabinet and the politicians.
Right.
So in a situation where CEB cannot set its output price independently, like any private company would, it's regulated essentially by the political space. In a situation where the CEB can't make the investments in infrastructure, in power generation that it needs to based on its technical analysis because it's constantly overridden by the political authority. And this has been going on since President Premadasa's time. So you know, the CEB used to have a very well done least cost generation plan. That said, back in the 90s, build a coal plant. Well, successive presidents vetoed it. We went for much more expensive thermal power, right? So I mean, we cannot say this is simply inefficiency in the CEB. So I think we need market-based pricing, and I think that's what the IMF is saying.
Yes.
If you do that, you will reduce the implicit fiscal deficit substantially.
Right.
Now, the question you then raise is, you know, what about the effects on poor people? What about the effects on industry? I think there are two separate issues there. I think the effects on poor people, yes, I mean, I think given the transition that we're going to go through a very hard time, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, we have to shield the poor as much as we can. That's what the IMF is asking us to do.
Exactly.
Right? So I'm not being contrarian here. So I think we need various ways. I think, and to be honestly, there's this proposal by the regulator that they want to revise prices, and I thought it was crazy because they raised the prices more for the low users.
Yes, I saw that, yeah.
Who are more likely to be poor.
Yeah, it was regressive.
So, you know, this is where maybe they were doing their job because they were operating within the parameters set for them by Parliament, but then Parliament should intervene. They should say, well, at least as a transitional matter, because we don't have a good way to protect the poor, at least leave these low users, leave them. And if you have to you go to market-based pricing where essentially you don't make a loss, well then there's an obvious solution. Raise the prices on the high users, on the high-using households, right? People like me. Force me to pay even higher than the production cost, essentially cross-subsidize support. So there are ways we can handle that, right?
Okay.
Now the other issue about the effect on economic development, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we do need market-based pricing.
Right.
I mean, we don't have a competitive export sector if it's simply based on subsidized energy inputs.
Right.
We could do that, you know, if we're a petro economy and have, you know, gas gushing out of the ground. We don't have gas and oil gushing out of the ground. Yeah. And we don't have the fiscal resources to subsidize it. So given that we want a competitive export sector, I think they should be made to face the market price. But what we do need to do is to allow the people who run the CEB to come up with a more efficient production plan, because that's what the politicians have prevented them from implementing for 30 years.
All right, okay.
So deal with that. On if I may comment on the other privatization aspect.
Yeah.
So I think some of this is just a bit crazy, some of this thinking, right? And the fact that they focused on it, right? And let me give you some background. I mean, you can probably tell from my accent. I sort of grew up, was educated in the UK.
Okay.
Yeah. And I lived through the Margaret Thatcher administration.
Right, okay.
The Margaret Thatcher administration was the British government which established this global fad for privatization.
Yeah.
All the privatization ever since, it goes back to what Margaret Thatcher did. And I will tell you, on screen, I voted for Margaret Thatcher. I think she was a great, competent economic manager. I supported her privatization program. I even bought shares in some of her programs, right?
Okay.
In some of those companies when they were peopleized, as President Premadasa would say, peopleized, not sold to other companies, but put on the stock exchange, right? But there's a huge difference between the Margaret Thatcher privatization program and what these guys are talking about. What these guys are talking about is more akin to the sell-off after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which not only left Russia as a dysfunctional economy, dysfunctional society, which did not improve its competitiveness to a large extent, but it also left it with a huge political problem with oligarchs.
Oligarchies, yeah.
Right? And so and I'll tell you what some of the key differences. Something that people don't appreciate about Margaret Thatcher. Yes, she privatized. But she should also be known for one other thing. She was the best manager of state-owned enterprises in public ownership of all British prime ministers. She took those SOEs which were loss-making and made them profitable under government control. And then she privatized. So her privatization strategy was first fix the company, then float it.
So that the state gets something back, because otherwise you're giving them something.
Not flogging off the family silver. She cleaned it up, she polished it, made it look more beautiful, and then sold it. She was acting in the public interest, right? And there's another part to this, especially when you talk about CB and CBC, some of these important markets which need regulation because in the public interest. Regulation is hard to do. It requires a high level of state capacity. So what the Thatcher administration demonstrated was they had the state capacity to run the industry first well, and then they set up the regulatory capacity. I find it a very hard stretch to say a state that cannot demonstrate basic management of these SOEs under government ownership is fit or able to do effective regulation, because that's much harder actually, right? So I think this is really quite screwed up, right? I mean, I am proud, and I say I voted for Margaret Thatcher, and I support her privatization program, which got us to this discussion. What these guys are suggesting is not that. They have no idea, right? And I'll give you just one example of Sri Lankan Airlines. It was a failure, the privatization, on many respects. First of all, it was reversed, which means it ignored the underlying political economy.
Right.
Secondly, it wasn't even privatized. You know, British Airways, Margaret Thatcher sold it on the stock market. What did we do? We sold it to another state enterprise. Not even a quoted state enterprise, right? It was not a PLC or whatever. It was Emirates, which is owned essentially by the Emirati, by the
the royal family.
The royal family doesn't publish its accounts properly, right? That's number one. Second, I'm a great believer in markets, but you need regulation, right? So in the airline industry, which is highly regulated, we have competition authorities. Competition authorities are very concerned about what airlines do in developed, rich countries.
Yeah.
Do you know what? The privatization previous of Sri Lankan Airlines would not have got through any competition authority in any of the advanced capitalist economies. They would have said, this is ridiculous. You're selling the airline to its major competitor, right? You're selling it, our major traffic route was to the Gulf. These two airlines together now control 90% of the seat capacity. You know what they would have said? Okay, if you want to do this, they would have told the government, if you're going to do this, you have to force Emirates and Sri Lankan Airlines to give up 50% of their seat capacity on the most profitable routes, right? And so this is like a crazy, people didn't think this through. And then I would just add, people say, but under Emirates they make profits. You look at their accounts. Sri Lankan Airlines did not make profits on the passenger component.
Oh, the other thing, yeah.
They made it on the ground handling, where the Emirates Airlines was given a monopoly by the state. Now, how do you explain to me how a state monopoly, a company which makes profits from a state monopoly, is demonstrating to you the superiority of market-based companies? I don't understand this, right? And then they transferred a lot of the capacity. So I think Sri Lankan Airlines lost its ticketing division. They even took our frequent flyer program, which is now the Emirates frequent flyer program, believe it or not. They took the ability to set prices. They took the computer systems and they took it to Dubai. They decapitated the airline. That wasn't developing the airline. And they did transfer pricing. So the Emirates are not stupid. I mean, I think they could live with a loss-making Sri Lankan airline operation, because what they were doing was transferring our passengers to the Dubai to take the more profitable routes. So I think all these things could be foreseen. The problem is we had no regulatory capacity, no government capacity to manage or to expect that, and that goes back to the problem. We shouldn't privatize when we haven't thought through the state capacity issues that it raises.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Ravi. Appreciate your time being here, and good luck with everything going forward.
Sure.
And let's see what happens to the election now.